Hello there and welcome to Good Morning Sri Lanka. You're with me, Harith, on the 17th of January 2013. Pleasure to be back in this new on Good Morning Sri Lanka after a slight break after Christmas. I think that's when I saw you last, and it's great to be back. Of course, Sri Lanka, when I come to the studio, there is always something interesting happening in the country, and plenty of stuff happening, of course, apart from the interesting cricket down under in Australia. There have been plenty of matches being played in the country itself in the political context, and today we do indeed have a very interesting discussion of which I will disclose in a bit. Of course, the Gmsl bill has been passed in the parliament in the last week, and it has been implemented, which is very interesting to see, because now there is quite a lot of support from the rural areas which do believe that there is a possibility that there is indeed a benefit for the masses from the Gmsl bill, and sometimes the attitudes have changed. Of course, the Gmsl bill was also to some the starting point of this conflict between the legislature and the judiciary, which ended, which I would hope ended last few days before, with a new Chief Justice coming into Sri Lanka and possibly a new era for the judiciary, or what of course would happen to the country, we are not really sure. But it is indeed very interesting, because suddenly there was a lot of clashes. There was the police, the batons, the police guards everywhere, and suddenly the next day it was all peaceful, and suddenly Sri Lanka possibly would have returned to some calm. Of course, there is a bitter feeling in some people's minds. Some people feel happy that the clash is over and things are getting along. Of course, Sri Lanka will be playing its third one day very soon. Of course, news is that David Warner and Michael Clarke will be returning into the squad of the Australians, so that won't be necessarily good news, but I think it is also something to be happy about, because that means Australians have got worried about what's going to happen. Internationally, there's been plenty of things happening. There have been clashes with France having an invasion on the Mali country, where there has been an allegation of terrorism, and there is a lot of use of force in alongside what's been happening in Syria. So there are clashes abroad as well, and even in Sri Lanka the floods, the landslides are continuing. So not the greatest of news, but of course the year is in full swing. You can see that from a slightly clashy beginning to the year, we are slowly swinging in to settling down to the year. You can see people settling down to their work trends, those people who come from abroad for their holidays settling down, and maybe some of them going back to wherever they were work, and leaving Sri Lanka unhappily. No one says that they don't want to be in Sri Lanka, because it's a wonderful country, it's a wonderful people, except that there are certain situations where certain things happen where people are not so happy, but we go on. We are resilient people. Petrol prices increase, but then the cars are still on the road. This doesn't mean that people don't use the roads. Of course, very interesting development recently with regard to the bus transport, where the National Transport Commission said that they are going to install CCTV cameras on all the buses. Well, that's going to cost them a lot, but indeed there's a lot that will happen with regard to the sexual harassment and all these problems, leading from what happened in India, the gang rape, where these accused have actually made a statement very recently saying that they are not going to plead guilty. Only one man has apparently pleaded guilty, and the rest are trying to get away, and huge issues which in India cause great outbursts. Of course, in Sri Lanka, where it does happen, doesn't cause as much as an outburst. Of course, this all relates to society, and society is very related to this concept of this wonderful noble profession which is practiced by those lawyers of law. Now today we are going to discuss something very interesting. Of course, we are not going to discuss the impeachment, we are not going to discuss the crisis, the constitutional crisis so-called, and all these problems that may have been caused in this country, but we are going to discuss the possible route to these persons who are all involved, from the Chief Justice of the country to the most simple, humble lawyer. We have to think about this important concept of legal education. The question we are going to discuss today on Good Morning Sri Lanka, with two very interesting gentlemen who are with me on set, is legal education in Sri Lanka good? Is it satisfying the need that a noble profession such as lawyers need to aspire to? So we have a very interesting discussion. We are going to discuss the current situation. Does it have an effect on lawyers as a whole? Should there be changes? compare our system in Sri Lanka to the legal education abroad, and so on and so forth. Of course, there was also, before we go into the commercial break, a very interesting story we came from Lance Armstrong, of course, with all the allegations of his drug use, had made a confession to Oprah Winfrey, where he had said that he had in fact confessed, of course not to the satisfaction of Oprah, that he indeed did have some drug substance abuse. Of course, hope other sportsmen don't take up similar practices in Sri Lanka or elsewhere. Anyway, with that we'll quickly go into a commercial break and be back about legal education in Sri Lanka. Hello there and welcome back to Good Morning Sri Lanka. You're with me here, Harit. 17th of January, this lovely morning, and let me introduce my first guest here. On my left we have Migara Dos, student from the Law College, a final year student from the Law College. Welcome, Migara. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being on the show. And also on the couch we have NK Ashok Baran. Good morning, Ashok.
Good morning, Harit.
He happens to be the secretary of the Law Students Association of Sri Lanka. In fact, I think we did have some students of yours previously on the show with regard to a program that you are doing. So, guys, what we're discussing here today is really the issue of legal education, as I explained. Let me start with you, Migara. Now, you're a final year student at Law College. Now, why did you enter into a field as law from Law College, or just law? Why did you enter the field?
Yes, Harit. Law, I think, is one of the most prestigious professions. In one hand, there is an understanding that law is a huge money-making profession, but then again, there is another perspective to it. Law could be understood as a profession that is pretty much important to make a huge social impact, positive social contribution. So I think that could be understood as the reason I entered legal education. So I think law is an ideal path to make a positive contribution to society if you learn it right and if you practice it right.
Right. So Ashok, now from what Migara says, I mean, of course, a lucrative profession. I think every profession can be lucrative if you do well. Coming to the issue about doing something for society, is that also part of your motivation to do law?
Exactly, because if you take any social issues, you will see lawyers standing out and talking for it. And of course, the social issues, whatever said and done, it's mostly related to law, and law has a greater role to play in these social issues. So I think that is a very big motivation for any person to become a lawyer. And on the other hand, if you take the politicians, most of them are lawyers. So law in any way is very much engaged with the society.
I see. Now, something we were discussing just before, Ashok, something we said that it's not necessary that someone who learns law becomes a lawyer. You agree with me on this?
Exactly, absolutely, because today law has different roles to play, and people who study law, I mean, they are the ones, I mean, they can get employed anywhere else because it's a very diversified field these days, and you see lawyers being, they don't practice mostly. Most of them, they become journalists, and they are into, they get into the corporate sector, and you also see politicians, many of them. So it is a very diversified field these days.
Indeed. Now, Migara, what we discussed just now, it seems that law is somewhat the how do you say, the fabric of society. It's connected to everything that there is in society. So, do you agree with me, or are there things that you can keep law out of?
Well, it's like this. Lawyers are mostly leaders. I think many would agree. They have an capacity to lead in whatever respective field that they represent. I think that's the reason behind the phenomenon you just explained. So I think you're right, and but then again, there are many other opportunities available to lawyers rather than law itself. They can be academics, they can be journalists, and so on and so forth. But then again, the phenomenon you just explained, why lawyers lead many fields, I think it's because of the leadership trait that is included in the legal education sector, and that is part of the characteristics of lawyers we find in society.
Now, as you said, there is a characteristic that we do endow upon law as the noble profession. Now, the nobility of a profession is something that comes from the specific reason that those learned in law are very specially learnt. They are skilled and they have a special learning, which suggests, of course, gentlemen, that there is a need for legal education of the highest caliber. Now, legal education, what would you understand legal education to be? I understand that you are learning law, but then what is legal education? Is it to give you the tools to become a lawyer? Is it the tools to be an independent thinker? What is it?
Well, that's a very, very broad question you asked. But then again, in answering it, what is legal education? It comprises of many areas that are there for the preservation and continuance of society. So it may include contract law, constitutional law, administrative law. So it's a very broad area. It's hard to give a precise definition on what legal education is.
One thing, you just mentioned the constitution. Now the constitution is of essence to a country and a society. Now, is it to learn something from a book or a lecturer and put it on a paper, or is it something that you must etch in your minds, in your society, not from only within for you but also for the general society? Is legal education that?
Well, as you spoke of constitutional law right now, a constitution is made by parliament, and then the lawyers and the judges are in the task of interpreting the constitution. So then there are many events that happen in society. Society is dynamic. Then based on that, the constitution is interpreted. So therefore it's always an ongoing process. So awareness amongst lawyers, law students would help us to interpret the constitution better and also interpret it right. So thereby I think social awareness is an important aspect of what you just explained to us. So that plays a leading role amongst lawyers and students.
Right. So discussing legal education, Ashok, would you say that legal education is different from any other type of education?
In the sense, other fields of education?
Yes, other fields, say medicine, say psychology, say art. Now they are all fields of education. What do you think there's a difference in legal education specifically?
Well, I think legal education is more about society, because I would say the law is one of the is the spine of the society, because everything, you take any other field, there is some aspect of law is involved. In every person's everyday life in the civilized society, there is law involved. So I think in that aspect, law is a very special field. And moreover, lawyers, in a literal sense, though we see lawyers as people who are practicing in the courts, but that is not the only role lawyers play in the society. As I said above, it's a very diversified role these days. So in that way, I think law is very much special, because you very rarely see non-practicing doctors. But you can very easily say non-practicing lawyers. So that makes it special than any other field of study.
Right.
But also the depth of the education, the legal education, and the way you're nurtured to see at things, I think that makes the legal education more special.
Discussing about the quality of law and legal education, we have to think about the next step, about access to legal education in Sri Lanka. Now, Migara, you are from the Sri Lanka Law College, and Ashok, you study at a private institute. Now, in addition to that, we do have the Sri Lanka Law Faculty under the University of Colombo, as well as the Open University, and I think several other private institutions. Now, there was a time, Migara, that legal education was not something that was provided. You had to go to court, watch the other lawyers and learn, a very long time ago. Yes. Then we had, I think, the Sri Lanka Law College and the Sri Lanka Law Faculty. Now we have opened gates with private institutes coming in. What do you think about this? Is it a good thing that there is wider access to legal education?
Well, basically, if there are students who are interested in learning law and are willing to learn law, I think there should be enough opportunities for them available. So principally, I have no disagreement about the availability of legal education. But then again, the question raises about the standard and quality of legal education, the final output of a law student, how he becomes a competent lawyer or not, based on this emerging avenues for law. I think that's a main consideration that the legal institutes and the legal academics of this country should focus on, to create a fully competent lawyer and make him a positive contribution to the legal profession and to society as well. Something complicated, and concentrating on academics and the standard and quality of legal education.
I think what you mean to say is, whatever the means to a legal education, the end product has to be a good lawyer.
Exactly.
And of course, with that, we'll take a quick break and be back with that thought.